practicalities associated with the energy crisis in Ukraine. Interestingly enough, earlier this morning, I had the privilege to participate in the Ukrainian National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C., where 1,000 people gathered to bring awareness about the current plight of the Ukrainians suffering in today's brutal war of Russia's aggression, but also brought focus on Ukraine's efforts for a just and sustainable peace that country rightfully, obviously deserves. So whether it was at the prayer breakfast this morning that I attended or today's discussion that we're having right now, to me, this is a discussion about light and darkness, quite literally. It is about the light of hope for Ukraine to achieve a victory in peace, and it is about whether hospitals can operate, families can stay warm in the winter, whether water can flow, and whether a nation under attack literally can continue to function despite the evils of Kremlin's crimes. This Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has entered a phase where energy infrastructure itself has become, I would say, a primary weapon. Power plants, substations, transformers, heating facilities are all deliberately being targeted, not basically as even collateral damage in war, but as true instruments of terror. The goal, I think, is clear for all of us. It is to free civilians into submission, to break that societal resilience that we've known Ukraine to have fostered for the past 4 years, and to test the resolve of Ukraine's partners. Ukraine's energy crisis, to me, is therefore not just a humanitarian emergency for us as a Ukrainian American community. It is frontline in a broader struggle over security, over deterrence, about the rules that basically govern international behavior, thus allowing energy, I think, to be weaponized against civilians without any types of consequences sets a dangerous precedent that we've been advocating for the past 4 years that go and stretch far beyond Ukraine. So assisting Ukraine during this energy crisis is about keeping people alive, but it's also about defending stability in Europe, safeguarding the global energy security, and affirming that democracies do not abandon those who stand on the front lines of aggression. We're fortunate today to be joined by truly leading experts to understand the technical realities, the strategic implications, and the policies before us. Their insights will help us move beyond sympathy to true action towards solutions that are urgent, that are realistic, and frankly speaking, that need to be impactful. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this critical discussion. For this webinar, for the purpose of this webinar, should you have any questions to our esteemed panelists, please provide them in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this webinar, a distinguished American diplomat who was the United States' first ambassador to Ukraine, a great friend of the Ukrainian American community, the Honorable Roman Popadiuk. Mr. Ambassador, the screen is yours.
Michael, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And welcome to all our viewers. Before I start, I'd like to first acknowledge and commend the work of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America in terms of highlighting the difficulties that the Ukrainian people are undergoing now under the brutal attack that the Russians are undertaking against the energy system in Ukraine. I commend you for bringing it to attention, but also taking the lead in terms of providing equipment to the Ukrainians to overcome this crisis. So keep up the good work, and if there's anything that any of us can do, feel free to call upon us. Michael aptly outlined the brutality of the Russian attacks on the energy system with the goals of not only undermining the morale of the Ukrainian people, but also as a negotiating tactic on the peace negotiations that are undergoing right now. I don't think it'll be successful. The Ukrainians are very resilient, and Ukraine will overcome this. And in the midst of this crisis, we forget one big picture, and that is the energy strength of Ukraine. Once it's unlocked, it'll be a real core of future growth and stability for the country. If you take a look at the broad spectrum of Ukrainian energy, Ukraine's gas reserves are one of the leading reserves throughout Europe. Shale gas, Ukraine is ranked like number 3 throughout Europe. And in terms of coal production, Ukraine is in the top 10 or so countries in the world in terms of coal capabilities that it has. Now, obviously, coal is being used less and less, and given the fact that the coal mines have been taken over by Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine, where most of the mines are located. Nonetheless, coal is important. But Ukraine has also a good base in terms of renewable energy, wind power, solar power, as well as hydropower. Matter of fact, through efforts of decarbonization and in order to meet EU standards as well as their own standards of moving toward renewables, the Ukrainian government is looking at getting up to 27% of its energy by 2030 from renewable energy. So there is a core strength in energy that Ukraine does have in reserves. If you also add to that the fact that Ukraine has the old Soviet pipeline system, and unknown to a lot of people, Ukraine has a vast underground storage capability for gas, like one of the top countries in the world for gas storage capabilities. These two systems, the pipeline system, the storage capability, augurs very well for future European security, for national security reasons, for storage of gas to be used in emergencies. So when you look at the combination of reserves and capabilities and their own infrastructure in terms of storage and pipelines, Ukraine sits pretty well. The issue, of course, is to end the war and to tap into all of these resources. And there'll be a number of challenges that Ukraine will face. I think one of the challenges, obviously, is going to be the financial one, and Ukraine itself will not be able to meet the financial pressures of rebuilding the country and rebuilding the energy sector. And so it'll have to look to the international community. I think the World Bank, in figures that it released last year, estimated that it would cost about $68 billion to rebuild Ukraine's energy sector alone. Now, that's an outdated figure. I'm sure it's risen this year and will continue to rise. So it's going to be an expensive procedure. It'll be important for the international community to lend its resources in this effort. But beyond that, Ukraine has a lot of endemic problems. We all know about the corruption issue, and energy has been one of the areas that's been heavy with corruption throughout the decades. There's also the issues of further decentralization of the system. So there are a number of issues, as well as the issue of pricing. Ukraine has to move toward market pricing, has to move away from subsidization of its energy sector. So those are all issues that Ukraine will have to face. Now, joining us this afternoon are distinguished experts in the area of energy in Ukraine, and they will try to address some of these issues that both I and Michael have raised. And I'm pleased to note that joining us is Paul Shmotolokha. Paul, it's nice seeing you again. Paul is the founder of NewUseEnergy. He's done a lot to help Ukraine in terms of small energy systems, portable energy systems. Also joining us is Oleksiy Povolotsky, who is from DTEK, the largest private sector energy company in Ukraine. And we also have Stephen Burns from the Institute for Security and Technology on Energy Systems. Also joining us is, did Jeff join us?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Yes, Jeff. Oh, there you are. Well, you're jumping around on the screen, Jeff. Stay in one place.
Not me. Somebody else is doing that.
Also, hi, Jeff. Nice seeing you. Also joining us is Geoffery Pyatt, a former ambassador to Ukraine and a colleague of mine from my old days. Nice seeing you again, Jeff. Thanks for joining us. Each of the panelists will have about 10 minutes to make their opening remarks, after which we will be happy to take questions from the audience. As Michael mentioned, you'll be able to join through the chat room, and Michael will be handling that. So without further ado, I think we'll start our program. And I know, Jeff, you're pressed for time. So why don't we start with you, Jeff, in your opening remarks?
Great. Thank you, Roman, for letting me go first. And I apologize that I have to be somewhat brief, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. Let me start with just pulling the fire alarm for everybody's attention. And Oleksiy will share more of this. I had the opportunity in Davos to be with the DTEK CEO, Maxim Timchenko, but also with a lot of my Ukrainian government friends. The situation in Ukraine today is a true humanitarian catastrophe. And it's very clear that Putin has decided during the winter, when he can't make progress on the battlefield, to do everything that he possibly can to break the will of the Ukrainian people. The situation in several of the big cities is acute. The most acute may well be Kharkiv, where 2 days ago, the authorities announced that because a number of the big CHPs had been taken out by Russian airstrikes, water is being drained from the distribution system, which means no potable water for drinking, no water for sanitation, and of course, no heat. And this is repeating itself across the board. Raman did a good job, Ambassador Popadiuk did a good job of framing the longer term proposition. But we're not going to get to the longer term if we can't address the immediate crisis. I delivered testimony on this issue on Wednesday before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's on the SFRC website, both in video and my written statement. I would encourage, in particular, a couple of minutes with my last exchange with Senator Murphy, who has been a great champion of Ukraine for many, many years, and he and I discuss the current situation and what we might do about it. He and I both express alarm that President Trump has been unwilling to call this for what it is. It is a war crime by any definition, but it's also a huge insult to President Trump's quite appropriate call for an energy ceasefire. Because as a practical matter, there's nothing that Ukraine can do militarily to stop this on its own. There are not enough. After several years of Russia building up its manufacturing capacity for Shaheds, and with the support of China, North Korea, and others, there is nothing that Ukraine can do militarily to stop these attacks. So there has to be a negotiated energy ceasefire, which I've been calling for publicly, which President Zelensky has been calling for, which DTEC has been calling for, and which President Trump thought he negotiated with Putin. But in fact, you see attacks like the killing of 15 DTEC coal miners last weekend, and literally every day. And let's be clear, there have been more drones and missiles sent against Ukraine in the past week than any other week since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We also need to be doing everything that we possibly can to help Ukraine to rebuild. I led this effort with Steve and others across the interagency during the Biden administration through our G7 Plus effort. I had the opportunity in Davos to catch up with all the key European partners that I worked with in that G7 capacity. The Ukraine Energy Community Support Fund, which the US contributed to initially, is now running out of money. They have far more requirements for transformers, switch gears, cabling, generators, repair equipment than they have resources right now, which is why I have been pressing publicly, including in a Reuters story that you can find, for the administration to, at the very least, leverage the money that was already appropriated by Congress for Ukraine energy sector support in order to plus up these resources. My sense from talking to friends in the administration is that the delay in this regard is not about putting pressure on Ukraine. It's just bureaucratic wrangling between state, which of course inherited all the money that was formerly appropriated to USAID, and other parts of the administration over whether to spend this money on critical minerals, spend it on supporting private sector investment. But the bottom line is, if we don't help Ukraine get through this winter, we're not going to be able to have these other conversations. Last observation, I remain very bullish long-term, as and you'll hear the same from Paul and Alexei in terms of the tremendous opportunities that Ukraine represents, the things that Ambassador Popadiuk alluded to in the energy sector. But to get there, we're going to have to get a comprehensive ceasefire. So that requires more pressure on Putin. That's why in my hearing, and you can see this also, I was very strong in my opening statement on the importance of additional sanctions now. The Foreign Relations Committee has reported out something called the Shadow Fleet Act, which would harmonize US sanctions against Nord Stream 2 with the European Union and also write into statute sanctions against Novatek projects like Arctic LNG 2. I think this is particularly important so that people like Steve Witkoff, who seem to imagine that there is a great energy deal to be done with the Kremlin, are circumscribed by statute. And I think it's a good sign that Republicans like Senator Graham are also pushing in the same direction. The Shadow Fleet Act that I allude to was passed out of foreign relations on a bipartisan basis. So I'll stop there. Look forward to the conversation and especially hearing from Oleksiy. But I would leave with everybody, do not underestimate the magnitude of the emergency. It's about 20 degrees negative, minus 20 degrees Celsius in Ukraine right now. And there is a real risk in a way that hasn't been the case since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of a catastrophic collapse in the days ahead.
Jeff, thank you very much for that comprehensive, overall picture on the ground in Ukraine. And it's very important what you pointed out in terms of the role that Congress can and should play. And maybe we'll return to that area in the question and answer period later. But that's very important. Congress can play a great role in this. At this time, Paul, why don't we turn to you, okay?
Okay, great. So first of all, it's great to be with such a distinguished group here. And since many of you don't know me, I may be a little longer in my introduction. I am a U.S. Army veteran, focused on counterinsurgency, which has a lot of why we started so early with what we do in Ukraine. I actually come out of the telecommunications industry. I built the first private networks from Budapest to Almaty, and I've not so fondly remember the winter of 92, 93 when the Russians shut off the gas. I was living in Kyiv at the time. So I sympathize greatly with everyone there. But my last 22 years have been in backup power and the last 15 in off-grid solar. So that's why I am focused on discussing a lot of the alternatives, the gaps measures and things that the average Ukrainian or the average business or the military and the like are using. So in 2020, I founded NewUseEnergy in response to a technology trend, which was the transition from lead acid to lithium batteries. And it was transforming the energy storage industry. We saw the prices coming down dramatically and the like. So we focused on building professional grade portable power solutions and industrial grade lithium batteries. And so we were doing disasters, already from 2021. That's kind of what we do. We respond to every major disaster. And so I just will say openly, if anybody wants to talk about any solutions, not just power, but Ambassador Pyatt brought up the water crisis pending. We work exactly with a lot of really good vendors in this industry that have various solutions when there is no grid, nothing around for weeks or months at a time. So we started in February 2022 with our first hospital installation in Lviv, actually in March. And I had a strong feeling at the time that this is what I would do if I was Russia. I would be taking down the grid. This is a modern country. And part of the feedback there is working in the disaster response or emergency management industry, the survivors of disasters, wildfires, hurricanes, anything, they will tell you, I will skip lunch for connectivity. So the value of connectivity is extremely important subject matter. In the hierarchy of needs, water comes first. But when we talk about energy, and the average person can live without a tremendous amount of light, but nowadays you can't let connectivity go. And you have to have power to run connectivity. And so that's one of the biggest challenges. Obviously, heat is a huge challenge, and not one where some of the solutions I work with is readily addressed. But it's really turning into a complex question, and I'll let some of the smarter guys, people with a higher perspective, but we're dealing with power, we're dealing with water, we're dealing with heat issues. So our focus being on the power, we focus in on professional grade users, critical infrastructure like blood centers, and we have our equipment in over 80 hospitals in Ukraine. And I'll kind of talk about all the alternatives that are available. But I just want to make a quick comment. I come from the perspective of resilience. And what we are doing today is responding to a humanitarian catastrophe, but I'm an advocate of doing it in a way where whatever you're investing in lasts, because this problem is not going away. I don't have hopes for a ceasefire. I am skeptical. That comes from my military background. Plan for the worst, and plan for a long one. So when I advise people to make investments in power backup or generators, I am first and foremost would ask and advocate everybody to think about quality, not price, especially if you're the Western NGO, because our equipment that we put in 4 years ago is still working. And a lot of the cheap Chinese stuff that's out there, it's very enticing and attractive. And some of them don't last weeks because they're not designed to. So I'm going to talk about quick to deploy independent power solutions. It's really the fingers in the dike, okay, if you will, because it's not going to solve the mainstream problem. The centralized grids are still the essential question, but they allow people to survive. They ameliorate their misery, which is a key morale question, and they are easy to use. Okay, and I do want to keep highlighting throughout this the term resilience. Okay, so first of all, I am a big believer that Ukraine can benefit with greater adoption of distributed, decentralized power generation. Ambassador Popadiuk talked about some, but for me, the ultimate in resilience, and same goes for the United States, and I myself am a practitioner on my own solar power plant at my house, but everybody has to understand the difference. Solar on your roof that feeds the grid is not resilience. It shuts down when there's an outage. You must have energy storage, which is the most popular today is lithium batteries. So that I have on my house. If the grid goes down, I not only drain from the batteries, but I'm able to reproduce with solar power and it refills the batteries. Okay, so it's just very, very important when we talk about, because prior to 2022, 98% of 99% of solar installations in Ukraine were without batteries. They were only power generation, big utility scale and the like. And they can feed the grid, but without energy storage, I don't think anything matters anymore. So if you're doing anything, got to figure out how to store the power. And we are talking about resilience on a national scale. It's not like there was a hurricane in Louisiana. We're really talking about a huge territory. And I liken a lot of the work that everybody does in that we have a lake of needs. It's full of water. And the only way you can really deal with it is it's one drop at a time. It's a rainstorm here and there. So if you have the resources, just try to structure your focus in a way that it continues to add to the resilience. Some of the and I'd say resilience requirements are humanitarian, economic, and military. The military, it has a huge infrastructure that it has to support, and power has grown in importance 150 times since I was in. I used to have to recharge basic batteries. That was it for radios. Now everything runs on batteries. And we have a saying, drone warfare is battery warfare. Okay, without it, you can't survive. So when we take a lot of our work into consideration, we're working civilian with high grade portable power. And at the same time, we're doing the same with military because I see a lot of junk in Ukraine. I myself, as a former soldier, am very angry with a lot of the old equipment that Ukraine's been given. Everybody's trash. I worked with M113s when I was a cadet in '85, and that same M13, well, Ukrainians like it, was given to Ukraine, but that's not my preferential approach. We have to get the most quality equipment that we can to Ukraine so it lasts and so that everybody can continue to use it. So what are some of the considerations? Durations of outage. It really affects the capacity of a solution that you have. And the solutions in general are generators, number one, gas or diesel. Usually the higher up you go, that's diesel, the smaller or gas. The higher up you go, the more installation support you need and the like. And then the next favorite is generally portable power stations. Everybody knows the term EcoFlow. It's become like Xerox, a generic term. That is a Chinese company, fully Chinese owned, where all the profits go lovingly to the Chinese Communist Party, as is Blue Eddy and all these other brands. So the market's flooded with them. Sadly, it's flooded with really cheap units as well that will just do not operate well under the current extreme circumstances that are there in Ukraine. We are in the most extreme of circumstances in either days of outages, or 20 hours on, maybe 2 to 4 hours of power. So, frequency of the outage, if it comes in and out, is important. A lot of these technologies are not UPSs that are being deployed. Like, you give a generator to a hospital, everybody's got to understand you still need uninterruptible power, because generators, they don't turn on like this. You can be in the middle of an operation. You've got to have battery storage. That's why we have a couple of hundred units working with some great NGOs like Canada Ukraine Foundation, Rotary International, and the like. And we put our equipment directly in the hospital rooms, because it takes up to 10 minutes for that generator to get cranking. Okay. You can lose a life in that time. And they have. Okay. And we've been it's kind of sometimes it's a very satisfying job for me, because we've given birth to babies, saved soldiers' lives and everything. Because that interval window, when they're on a ventilator, it can't go down. So duration, frequency of outage, and then there's a lot of sensitive equipment that we care about in critical infrastructure. So there's a lot of issues right now with power conditioning, and Alexi is going to go into it. But just to highlight it from a personal user perspective, you can see extreme spikes. And if you don't have power conditioning, it's not only you can have a backup power system, but it's going to flow right through it. If you got equipment plugged in, it's going to toast it. Okay. And then there's the low line, which a lot of our users are finding when right now the grids are sagging. And when that happens, you kind of dim the lights and the like. But if you're running sensitive equipment, radios, hospital lab equipment, surgical equipment, it can go down unless you click over into uninterruptible power supply. So those are some of the considerations from a user perspective. It's just very complex. There's a lot of things to consider. And the biggest one, though, right now is your time to recharge. And how do you recharge your energy storage device? So whether if you have a generator, you need fuel, but you need to turn it off before you refuel it. I saw a video on Instagram yesterday, and somebody was showing off their generator, and they were refueling it while it was running. And that is the next recipient of a Darwin Award, because more people die in the US from generator usage after hurricanes than from the hurricanes, because they pour fuel on generators while they're running and it spills and then goes kaboom. So CO2 poisoning on generators is a big concern. And then, of course, maintenance. So people have to understand gas or diesel generators are not meant for primary power unless there's somebody like DTEC running a huge size generator and they know how to maintain them. And maintenance personnel are very short right now in Ukraine for generators. A lot of the hospitals we work with are complaining. The maintenance guys are in the army. A lot of the talented people. It's a very practical, small nuance, but it's just something that must be taken into consideration. And then the final consideration in generators is budget for fuel. I've been told by hospital directors, I can either pay my people or I can buy fuel for a generator. Please send us your batteries. It doesn't cost me anything to run. So there's just these, it's always some kind of issue. No solution is perfect. Around the battery side, there's one category of easy to use. These are consumer grade units. They're plugging the gap in residential. They're small, they're bigger. They're not great for really serious applications. You run a heater on them, they're going to break. You're never bringing them back. So there is a graveyard of EcoFlows around Ukraine, for example, especially with military guys breaking them and trashing them. So they're meant to be they're designed for US users for occasional use and for camping on weekends and the like. But Ukrainians put them to amazing use. But the key question is, do people know how to maintain it? How fast do you recharge it? But it certainly solves that problem. You can have that one light in the building that's on, and that's probably a user of some kind of portable power. We address the industrial commercial users of portable power. So we build a better mousetrap, and our focus is ease of use, quick to deploy. So I think that's a key question. How quickly can you deploy? We're doing a lot of projects right now, and we just shipped a bunch of units to points in Ukraine from our Lviv warehouse, and it's about pressing 2 buttons and it works. But there's a whole strategy around how do you recharge them. Like we designed our stuff to recharge really, really fast because we anticipate no grid or bad grid. And then solar plus anything is good, but it's really hard for people to understand solar. I had a major NGO last week I was consulting, and they're like wanting to put 200 watts of solar on a 2.5 kilowatt hour battery. It's basically never going to recharge if it's been discharged. So you got to understand the right ratios. You also have to consider there's all these MDUs in Ukraine. So what's interesting is, and I'm a big advocate of this for Ukraine, balcony solar. They got a ton of it in Germany and Spain now. And it works a bit with the MGUs if you're south facing. Obviously, you don't want to be facing north. But private homes, there's not a huge amount. I mean, it's evolved in Ukraine, but the mix in the cities is still tilted. And solar is a lot easier to use there. Either rooftop, put it against the side of your house, things like that. So ease of use of solar has improved. There's not enough solar installers in Ukraine. We actually funded with an NGO a solar training institute for veterans in Kharkiv at the Polytechnic, and the focus there is teaching everybody how to work with batteries. I have sadly seen a lot of inexperience with batteries, and it's getting better. Okay, the market is flooded with so many cheap solutions and the like. They don't always work. That's one experience I had in the off-grid industry, just to share, is poor quality doesn't last, and I think you need to be planning for many years. And so finally, there's also an interesting category of using a simple hybrid inverter with batteries in the home. So you can either plug it into your mains panel. You need a qualified electrician to do this. But it is, then I've seen a lot of kludges. So it's like a car inverter or truck inverter with batteries and all sorts of things. My aunt has one of those, and I got her one of our units because I'm afraid her house or her apartment's going to burn down. But there's a lot of people doing this. Safety is a big question, but obviously when you're in an emergency, you do anything possible. And then finally, I also think Ukraine's future, we everything we do today, it needs to work for the next 10 to 15 years. Make that investment for 10 years, because everybody recalls 2013, I think it was, when Russia took the grid down, or a third of the grid in Ukraine down, rather, with a cyber attack. I don't think we could have a ceasefire. I don't fear they might stop sending shaheeds. That doesn't mean they stop hurting the grid. I'm a skeptic on this, and Resilience and DTEC is an amazing company doing amazing things with very brave people. I do want to give a shout out because we have worked with some of those guys in Kherson and the like, and they it's not just now that they're being killed. They've been killed for several years out there trying to fix transmission and distribution, and they are true heroes. But finally, for the long term, wherever we can find the money today, that could possibly be in the future. But I'm a huge fan of microgrids. I think there needs to be a lot of pockets of resilience, and the prices are coming down on microgrids, but they take a long time. They're not an immediate solution, and they can be targeted by shaheeds. So not a lot of people are putting money into huge battery microgrids right now. But somebody asked in the chat, what can you do to help? Advocacy or NGOs? A lot of NGOs are gathering funds right now, and I'm happy to help anybody. It doesn't have to be buying from me or my equipment, but I am a strong advocate of the quality solutions that last, and that they won't be sitting 6 months from now wondering where their gas is going to come from. So there's lots of ways to skin the cat. I hope that was helpful.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was very helpful and very informative, because you gave a very good bird's eye view of the practicalities and difficulties of operating battery systems and the need of them and how they operate. It was very, very informative. I think our viewers got a good grounding in understanding how these systems operate. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure we'll probably have questions related to that when we finish our presentations. At this time, I'd like to turn to Alexei. Alexei, if you could just fill us in on the role of DTEC at this time.
Yes, good evening, everyone, and thank you for trying to give you a bit more information, detailed information about our situation. My technical question is, anybody from the organizer can show a short video?
Michael?
I've allowed you access, so you could show it directly from your computer.
Unfortunately, I don't have the access to
That's
the
fine.
video.
Continue
Yeah.
with your presentation and let me upload it, okay?
Okay, thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Indeed, we have lots of trouble during this winter. And as Ambassador Pyatt stressed, Russians, they're not very effective on the battlefield, and they're trying to deprive Ukrainians of having heat, electricity, water supply. And here are some pictures of the recent attack. This happened just 3 days ago. This is one of our thermal power stations. Direct hit of missiles, and you see the status, the condition of the power station. So this is huge destruction, and we just recovered this station just maybe 1 month ago. If you may remember, from beginning of 2025 until end of September, it was a ceasefire, and this allowed us to recover our power generation a lot. And since October until now, in February, we have 9 attacks on our power stations, and we lost a lot of power generation. The same was in 2025 for gas sector. Russians changed their tactics in the beginning of 2025 and start attacking gas production. And now, unfortunately, we had to import a lot of gas. So our government reached our partners and donors asking to help to buy foreign gas and bring it into Ukraine. And this is at the time when Ukraine can produce enough gas for itself and even export gas out of the country. So one of the key tasks here is to recover domestic gas production as soon as possible in order to be able for the next winter season to have our own gas. Of course, the electricity sector is in crisis, and this is the most severe situation since the beginning of war in 2022. We have huge shortages of electricity supply. We have blackouts across the country, and both generation and transmission capacities are hit. And what Russians they're trying to do, their tactics is to split whole territory of Ukraine into the zones. And I will show you later how they trying to do that. And as it was stated, indeed, for several, in some regions, in some cities, we don't have electricity for days. In the city of Kyiv, we didn't have electricity for 24 hours. The biggest disruption of electricity supply in my apartment was 36 hours. So the situation is quite dramatic. And this is especially in the situation when you have temperatures like that, -20, 25. And this is very severe conditions for people who live in the cities and for energy workers to recover destroyed energy objects. This is the map when you see the targets, the hits of our thermal power stations. And unfortunately, all 3 power stations of the tech group in central and eastern parts of Ukraine are not operational at this moment of time. And we envisage that power deficit can be as much as 8 gigawatt. This is a huge number for Ukraine. And if this happens, Ukrainians will stay without electricity for the majority hours during the day in majority regions of Ukraine. And this is due to huge attacks on thermal power stations. All 5 power stations of the tech group were heavily damaged, and 3 of them are not operational at all at this moment of time. Heating infrastructure collapsed, and you definitely heard about Kharkiv situation during the last couple of days. You heard about the situation in the city of Kyiv, where thousands of apartment blocks are without heating and electricity supply. And what people do, they simply try to move in the rural area if they can. Some people move abroad if they can. At the same time, the majority of people stay in the cities, and this is the key task for the government, for the mayors of the cities, and for us as the energy company to recover as soon as possible. And we do our best. Here you see the graph from, let's say, end of 24. You see the gray, this is the number of how many megawatts we had before Russians, they changed the tactics and started attacking power generation. Red, this is how many megawatts they destroyed, and green, how many megawatts we recovered. So you see that this is continuous process, and I describe it like you have the tap open and water is on the floor, you're mopping the water, but the tap is running. So this is our situation when we should recover when the attacks are every day on us, and we don't have any other situation and the possibility not to do this job, because without our help, without our job, Ukrainians will not be able to survive. Now, this is the short picture of the TSO and DSO infrastructure. Lots of power stations were damaged. This is the second biggest problem for the energy system. So Russians, what they're doing, they are destroying power generation, and they are destroying the capacities how to bring electricity within the country from our nuclear power stations and from Western, our neighboring countries. We cannot transmit electricity from Western regions to central part of Ukraine and to the eastern part of Ukraine. And this is, again, big problem. And we have isolated regions, as you may see here. Of course, the better situation is in the western part of Ukraine, and the Kiev city, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Zaporizhia, Odessa, they are struggling. The people not having electricity for many, many hours. And you see the picture with numerous attacks, which we experience literally every day. What are the solutions? And here, as the tech group, we invest everything possible, but you can understand that the scale of attack, the massive destructions, nobody in this country can cope on its own. That's why we work closely with our partners and donors, and we used to cooperate with USAID. Now we try to continue our cooperation with Tetra Tech, which has some funds under the Spark project, and we believe that Spark, or maybe it will be another vehicle, will receive additional funds from the US government, which are critically needed right now for Ukraine, and US will be able to help in such difficult times to us. The second biggest donor, Ukraine Energy Support Fund, which is the special vehicle of Energy European Commission, and they help us a lot with equipment funded by European governments. And without this help, we wouldn't be able to recover at the same speed as we do at this moment of time. At the same time, on this picture, you see uncovered needs as of December 2025. So we need about 87 million euro for recovery of power generation. And this number doesn't stipulate the number which we will calculate later after the attacks on 3rd of February this year. And with this money, we would be able to recover up to 3 gigawatt capacity, which is the cheapest which you can imagine. Because if you compare how much it would cost to build new generation like wind or solar or gas, it will be 1 million plus per megawatt. And here we are talking about the number of 30,000 per megawatt. So this is the cheapest alternative. We also have a great possibility to retrofit one survived power unit, and we expect that the amount will be up to $50 million. And this is a great possibility because with this unit, we will be able to have additional 250 megawatts to the system. Also, power distribution, as I said, huge destruction, and we as the tech, we're having 40% of electricity distribution within the country. So we are the biggest player here, and we have needs in power equipment like different transformers, cables, switch yard equipment, etc. And of course, gas production, we invest a lot into recovery of our domestic gas production. At the same time, we require additional supplies of equipment like gas compressors and other. And here, thanks to again to Spark for helping us and for considering our requests. And of course, air defense. Air defense is the key. You can imagine how it would be much easier to hit the missile or drone in the air than when this missile or drone hit the station, and you have to remove debris, you have to analyze your equipment, you have to have the money to buy the equipment, and the lead time for high voltage equipment is usually around 1 year. So definitely we need more air defense systems, we need more ammunition for them, and this is quite critical when you have one air defense system located near to our station. We have new attack, but no rockets, no ammunition. So everything that Russians sent to us was hit our enterprise, and this is not right. And probably maybe if I should conclude about our urgent needs, which are the key, as previous speakers underlined, that we need to survive. And next winter, actually, if I may say, it's tomorrow. We should start preparing for the next winter as soon as possible. And probably it will be the same cold as this winter, because previous 5, maybe 7 years, we had mild temperatures during the winter. This one is the game changer. And you see how it's much more difficult for Ukraine to survive when you have temperatures like -15, -25. So if we have the same more or less temperatures next year, we must be prepared to have our power generation recovered. We must be prepared for our transmission and distribution lines to be ready to transmit electricity across the country. So this is the key message from me, and also air defense. Please, if you can, help our military, our government with that. And a few words about the future. We, as the one of the biggest players in Ukraine, we think not about the war, we think about the future of Ukraine. And we understand that we must modernize, we must build better energy system. And we started doing it now. We cannot wait until the war is finished. And this is very important to create partnership, to have some impulse from the government level to start realization of the projects of the future today. And here I just showed a couple of examples, Switzerland under SECO and France under France Fund. These funds were created just 1 year ago. And the governments, what they do, they finance their domestic manufacturers of energy equipment, which manufacture equipment, and together with Ukrainian beneficiaries, they realize projects in Ukraine. And for example, with France Fund, we are building modern digital substation in the city of Bucha. You very well know about the name of the city occupied in the first months of the war. And this is like a new signal, modern system, modern technology that we are realizing together with GE Vernova. And I wish we had more chances like that. So governments financing not Ukraine, not us as the tech, as energy company, they are financing their local producers of energy equipment. We create projects together, which will definitely have huge impact on the energy system in the future, and realize these projects. And I see a huge opportunity for us to discuss a role of the USA after the war, and maybe we should start doing that right now. I see a possibility to create energy system modernization fund, which will be helping US businesses and Ukraine to modernize its grid system, to build resilient, decentralized green energy power generation. And we definitely can be one of the key security partners for Europe in energy supply and in energy sphere. This is it from my side. Thank you very much.
Well, Alexei, thank you very much. A very comprehensive and detailed overview of the situation on the ground and what your company is doing. I took a number of takeaways from there. Number one, as you emphasized, the Russian attacks are not only an attack on energy, but also through those attacks, an undermining of the whole social and economic fabric of the country, which brings home to a lot of people, I guess, joining this webinar, the massive problems that this strategy that the Russians have implemented is posing to Ukraine. And parallel to that is, unfortunately, as you mentioned, and it was in your slide there, that Ukraine doesn't have the proper air defense systems to protect against these attacks. So it's important for the West to come through and support Ukraine. But you ended on a positive note. You talked about the future, and in your line there, I think next to the last slide, you talked about the energy system continues to function. That is a credit to the Ukrainian people, their resilience. It's also a credit to you and DTEC in terms of making sure that the system, as best as possible, given the circumstances, functions. So thank you for all the work that you're doing on behalf of Ukraine. And hopefully, the West will be able to coalesce a lot better and help even more. So with that, I'd like to move on to Steve.
Thanks, Ambassador. Early in my career, I always hated going last because I'm like, as I sit here and I listen and other folks are making points, I'm like, oh, that's the point I wanted to make. I want to make that point and so on. Now it's actually kind of a relief because by the time you get to me, so much has already been said that I could probably shrink my remarks down to a couple of minutes so we can get into the Q&A. But, with that aside, I do have a couple points I want to bring up. I know we're supposed to stay in the practical, but if I could, I would like to start briefly in the abstract and then move down to the practical because, as much as our hearts bleed, as much as we are trying to support Ukraine, I think just more broadly, as a coalition of aligned democracies around the world, we need to be aware that others are watching, right? Other potential malign actors are watching, and our response to this conflict is going to shape, I think, the global order going forward, right, for the next generation. And so if I could just start with the point, I think we need to reaffirm as a global community that you don't wage war by breaking civilian life. Okay, and as has been brought up multiple times today, the attacks on the energy system are exactly that. An attempt to break civilian life, and I reject, and I'm perhaps projecting onto some conversations I've had on the side. I reject the dual use argument that comes up that there's no fine line anymore between civilian and military targets because energy and water and telecom, they're all interconnected between civilian and military use. Okay, and so to me, the question isn't whether infrastructure has some military relevance, okay, and whether there's an attacks at infrastructure, right? There's a more practical test, and that's the intent of the attack. It's, as we see here, it's timed for winter demand. It's aimed at assets with long replacement times, right? Large transformers, okay? It's freezing up district heating facilities due to lack of fuel, and so that can't just be viewed as collateral damage, right? That's civilian coercion, and I just as a group, I don't think we should be letting that stand globally. So thank you for just permitting me that bit of philosophy at the start, before I get into maybe some more I think grounded comments there. So if protecting said civilian infrastructure, right, is the core norm, I think Ukraine's energy resilience is how we operationalize that norm, and that's not the abstract concept here, right? So Ukraine's resilience, as we've talked about, that's heat in the winter, that's power to hospitals, that's water to families. Okay, it's honestly just the ability to live daily life, right? Under pressure. Okay, to some of Paul's comments about connectivity, when I was trying to track outages in Ukraine, do you know how I tracked it? I was looking at online documentation of connections to certain IPs, right? Internet providers, right, within Ukraine. And when you would see those connection numbers go down, that's how you knew power was out, right? So to his point, just daily life. Okay, so there's something to be said for that. So I guess the other point I want to address from side conversations, right, because we see these massive needs. Okay, supporting Ukraine's energy system, it's a strategic investment. It's not an act of charity, right? These troops aren't intention, right? And we've already talked about the documentation, or we've already talked about how Ukraine can support European security, provide supply to Europe in future, and so on. But if we just look more immediately, okay, there are very practical reasons that we need to be supporting Ukraine's resilience, even beyond the humanitarian. Okay, as we've talked about, Russia's campaigns designed to produce outages and to wear down civilian morale, erode confidence in the government, and so on. And every time, and I think it was you actually took my point I was going to make on this, right, Ambassador, right, which is, credit to the Ukrainian engineers, the repairmen, okay. Every time they're out in the field, every time they repair the substation, power gets back up on time, critical services are running, that Russian strategy fails. Resilience reduces the payoff in these civilian targets, okay, and it does it in the most direct way possible. And hopefully we get to this point of a recognition of the futility of those attacks, okay, and can bring the conflict to end sooner, okay? And again, Ukraine's experience here, again, undeserved experience, okay? But this is providing, or it's shaping how we about security going forward. Okay, there's kinetic warfare, there's cyber warfare, and this is having and the response to it is informing us about how to respond to future aggression. Okay, restoration practices, redundancy measures. We've already started to talk about it in the conversation today. How we better coordinate. Okay, and as I said, others are watching and seeing this coordination. Has benefits just beyond the immediate and the tangible. Okay. So if our support is sustained, it's effective, it's going to establish that practical expectation that attacking civilian infrastructure triggers an organized response, a coordinated response amongst other aligned nations. And that precedent is going to matter, as I said, into the future. So now let me get down into some of the practicalities, okay? So what tools do we have available to us, okay? And, I think visually. Okay, and so in my prior life, I've done a fair amount of work in Eastern Europe, a lot of work on anti-corruption and so on in the energy sector. And I would always describe my approach to others. It's like if you think about squeezing a balloon, like you take a balloon and you push it in your hands, okay, there's always that section where if you're not applying pressure, the pressure escapes somewhere else, a bubble comes up. It's kind of the same thing here. If we're not aligning our response, okay, there's always going to be an area where that pressure, if you will, escapes, and the response to some extent is going to fail. So I think about it in four ways. Okay, I think about it in security assistance, which has been discussed. Okay, about aligning anti-drone technology near critical assets. Okay, bluntly, drones are cheaper than high voltage auto transformers, and they can be produced a lot faster, right? So that need remains, okay? The continued need, and I think Ambassador Pyatt brought this up, I think everyone's brought this up, the continued material support to the sector writ large. This is where speed matters, pre-positioned spares, mobile substations, microgrids, fuel supply. We haven't talked about that, about alternate fuel supply getting into Ukraine, as production capacity there is diminished through attack, modular generation. Allied coordination has been most effective when it's done in advance. Not after it's hit. But there's a point I want to make just from an approach standpoint, and I think we've alluded to it, but we haven't gotten directly into it yet. Is that we have to scale beyond government to government donations. Supply chains are stressed. I think we've referenced that. Okay, I think we noted a year plus for high voltage equipment. I've seen it 2 years plus. Okay, so what we really want to be doing is thinking or leveraging how to better engage private firms. Okay, but the key with that, and this is something I struggled a little bit in explaining to some of my government counterparts, right, is, you know, in the government, we're all conditioned to least cost. How do you bring in a least cost solution, right? When you're bringing in private sector firms, they have to be compensated for that risk premium. Okay, and so there's ways we have to think about doing that. Okay, be it a subsidized insurance platform, price guarantees, basement on certain contracts, or so on. You know, other incentivizing mechanisms to leverage some of that capacity, you know, that's within the private sector. Okay, but doing it in such a way that, you know, we're not creating a pathway, you know, to leverage, you know, the Ukrainian financial future. Okay, and, you know, I have to give advice to my Ukrainian colleagues as well. You know, there's, for a long time, you know, prior to the war, even, there were barriers to entry into the Ukrainian market. You know, the state-owned enterprises and others have such a large market share. There has to be a willingness, right, to allow some of these third-party generators and other assets in, you know, ceding some of that market share. Again, all of this is solvable. They're solvable problems. You know, we just got to get out of these traditional silos we have: government to government, diplomatic, you know, conversations, the military silo for defense, and so there's ways to get there. Okay. Again, we're short on time. We're past 1 o'clock, so I'll just highlight, you know, we've talked about sanctions, export controls, diplomacy. Okay, I'll just note those. I won't get into those. You know, I'm an engineer by training, you know, so diplomacy is not the most intuitive, you know, approach for me. You know, I like to think more about supply chain and equipment supply and fuel contracts and so on. But, you know, just highlighting that there are so many angles that, you know, we need to be doing, you know, simultaneously. And, you know, I want to give a lot of credit, you know, to Ambassador Pyatt, you know, for a lot of the work he did with the G7, you know, and then just, you know, I'm not highlighting one country's or one administration's approach over the other. You know, just, you know, that continued work on all fronts, I think will help best support Ukraine. Would love to get into the Q&A a little bit on how maybe we can operationalize some of these aspects, but it's maybe better done that way than me sitting here after folks have been listening for an hour. So I'll pause there. I'll turn it back to you, Ambassador Popadiuk. And
well, Steve, thank you very much for those comments. I think you raised a very important point in terms of the distinction between civilian and military targets. And it's a shame, you know, that the international community is not paying more attention to that. To me, it's quite obvious. I'm not an international lawyer or anything, but it would seem that there's some kind of breakdown in international law and some kind of stipulations in international law against obviously targeting civilians, and targeting the electrical grid is basically targeting civilians. It's not a military. You know, when you hit electrical grids that help maintain hospitals, schools, and apartment complexes, that's not a military target at all. So there's got to be some kind of movement, I hope, on the international level to put pressure against the Russians to stop this. And there's got to be something under international law that they could point to in terms of pushing the Russians in the right direction to stop this kind of barbaric activity. That concludes the presentations of our panelists. I want to thank all of them again. We're going to turn to the Q&A session, but before I turn to that, are there any panelists that want to comment on their colleagues' comment they made that you agree with, disagree with, or you want to elaborate on? I'll leave the floor open.
I
guess
just thank you, Steve, for the shout out. I will say, the U.S. leaving in a practical way, the G7 group has left a massive vacuum, because it was exactly the kind of thing that the U.S. government does well, mobilizing our allies and partners around the world, but also mobilizing all the different pieces of the U.S. government. And Steve was a big part of keeping us untangled. What I want to come back to, and I put in the Q&A a link to the Reuters story about this $250 million or so. And the amount doesn't matter. I've had people tell me, no, it's not that much. But the important point is, since January 20th of last year, we have provided $0 of U.S. government money to support energy sector resilience, despite the fact that money on the table, which was appropriated by Congress for this purpose. And I think we all need to be working in order to at least kick that loose, because as Alexei said very clearly, preparation for the winter of 2026-27 begins in about a month and a half. And we know, Steve and I lived this, the procurement timelines are long, and the Europeans are doing a lot, but it's the United States that has a lot of the capacity, has the resources, and the industry.
Okay, great. Jeff, thank you. I know your time is limited. I have a question. Let me start questioning here, first of all, Michael, if you don't mind. Jeff, you mentioned in your opening remarks you were at Davos. You just commented about the U.S. role, et cetera. So it's kind of piggybacking on your comments and Steve's comments about the civilian versus military sector. Let me ask you a generic question. What was your feeling out in Europe about the Europeans and them coming together on Ukraine? What can they do better? And even beyond Europe, the broader national community, are they willing and able to come to the assistance of Ukraine on this energy crisis? What would the Europeans want to do? I know we've talked about a number of funds, and Alexei made mention of them, but I'd like to get a political sense from your presence there, Davos, and your interaction with Europeans, what the feeling is of the situation on the ground. This is more of a political question, maybe, than an energy question, but what's the feeling now? I think our audience would love to know what the feeling of the international community is, given what's going on the ground in Ukraine now, both including the war and the peace negotiations.
So I would first emphasize that a lot of what I was doing in Davos, what Maxim Timchenko was doing in Davos, was trying to keep a spotlight on Ukraine, even amid the fire hose of competing issues: Greenland, Venezuela, Iran, etc. I think, ironically, Europe is much more focused today on Ukraine than anybody in the United States is, because they have realized that whatever happens in the months ahead is going to be the determining factor in terms of Europe's security situation for the years ahead. So there was considerable interest. It's no surprise the whole Greenland thing, especially during Davos week, was a huge blow to trust and confidence in the United States. And in my business, trust is the coin of the realm. And I think the good news is there is a determination, especially among European companies, to continue to look for opportunities in Ukraine, for all the reasons Alexei described, because of Ukraine's resources. But there is also tremendous fear about Putin's intentions, and then deep confusion about the intentions of the United States government. There are days when President Trump is very strong and criticizes Putin, but there are also days when his lieutenants, and I would single out Steve Witkoff in particular, seem to be drinking all of the Medvedev Kool-Aid. And you hear that in the suggestion that there's some great economic opportunity to be captured. And when people like Steve Witkoff are talking about these economic arrangements, it suggests that there's going to be some future normalization with Russia. And my own view is that we're going to have to contend with a hostile Russia for a generation to come. And that's why the steps that Congress is taking in terms of sanctions are so important.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jeff. Michael, I'll turn it over to you because I know you had some questions through the chat room.
One very technical question, but actually, while Ambassador Pyatt is still with us, if you're still with us, Mr. Ambassador, what more? I know that you testified on Congress just a few days ago. I saw you at the USUBC conference a few days ago as well. We're talking about energy. We're talking about the next phase for technology in Ukraine when it comes to energy. But obviously, the fact right now is that there is $250 million that unfortunately is not being spent in Ukraine. You're in Congress. We do advocacy in Congress. We have an advocacy event coming up in 2 weeks, as a matter of fact, for the 4th anniversary of full-scale invasion. What more do you see us doing in terms of our congressional meetings and in terms of our advocacy? Because our advocacy It won't be just in Congress. We can do this with administration officials, and frankly speaking, we can do this on local level as well if at all necessary.
I think you need to keep elevating the Republican voices, people like Chairman Daines, who I testified before this week. And if you watch the hearing, he had a very clear-eyed view on Russia. In fact, his opening statement, which I haven't figured out how to put things in a chat, but if you look into the Q&A, you'll see a lot of things that I've posted.
Yes.
But I will put in to the chat Senator Daines' YouTube of his opening statement, which you will see is extremely strong on the need to put pressure on the Kremlin. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to post this. I'll just put it into the chat box there, into the Q&A box, and somebody else can share it with the wider group. I would encourage you to be talking to him because he clearly, darn it, I only seem to be able to put things into one.
That's okay, Mr. Ambassador. We'll get this information out to all of those that are participating in this conference, in this webinar. We have your video from Senate Foreign Relations. We have your testimony, so that we can get out. It's just a matter of, we are literally in Washington in 2 weeks, and we have this opportunity, as we're going to be walking the halls of Congress and knocking on those congressional offices, to make this first priority for everything Ukraine related. Obviously, there's sanctions and other matters, but I think energy for right now is most important.
Great. And if you look under Lucas's question in the question and answer, you'll see a whole bunch of things from me, including in particular Senator Daines' opening.
Yes.
Which I would commend to everybody.
Excellent.
And both Senator Daines, Senator Shaheen have pushed very hard on the need to vote now on the Shadow Fleet Act. And again, this is an area where you have a bipartisan agreement, and we should have done it weeks ago.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Great.
Ambassador.
I have to run now, but thanks all.
Thanks, Jeff. Take care.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care. Michael, are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's some technical questions here, and frankly speaking, what I'm thinking of, it's already 75 minutes into the webinar.
Yeah.
I can ask, in general, there was a question about the feasibility of SRM adoption as part of a comprehensive approach to energy resilience. I think that's a deep tech question. Specifically, there was a very technical question when it comes to power generation that's being destroyed, and it'll take years to rebuild. There's an opportunity to use advanced conductors such as ACCC to upgrade the existing transmission lines between in Europe. I don't know if this is an opportunity for our guest from DTEC, for Alexei to answer that particular question, or if anything, I can provide questions to the relevant panelists. We can get some answers from you in writing, and we can distribute it to all of the participants.
Well, we press the time now, you're saying?
No, if people are still interested, if people have time.
Well, let's turn it. Maybe Alexei and Paul want to address some of these issues.
And Steve, I see, has
Steve.
his hand up as well.
Yes. Steve, yeah. So
Alexei.
Steve, do you want to start? We'll go down.
Sure. So I would just say to some of these points that have come in about, other generation options. I mean, obviously, Ukraine is in an all of the above situation. In terms of energy resources. With regard to increased transmission into Ukraine, that's something that we've been looking at over the past couple years. So trying to find ways to do it. What I would say is thinking about it beyond the technical, right? Because a great technical solution can get stymied by politics or policy all the time, I think, as we all know, right? It's about incentivizing the border countries as well, and then the transmission system on, what some of the increased transmission capacity could be, right? In terms of just maintaining overall grid stability and reliability within Europe. So I want to make that point. On some of the other options, I think SMRs, yes, that is a longer term play for Ukraine. We would obviously be concerned about, fissile material in Ukraine at this point, as we've already seen a little bit of a disregard for nuclear safety from some of the attacks and some of the way it's been handled. So definitely potentially something for the longer term. Ukraine's power system was always designed to move power from large generation centers to smaller ones, right? I mean, to smaller load centers. So you lose a little bit of the advantage of SMRs there, but still, it's a possibility. And then I see a hydrogen question there. I would actually go back to Paul on that a little bit, just because I think part of the reason Ukraine's power system hasn't failed has been a lot of localized generation, a lot of smaller systems installed around the country that have helped stability maintain in some city blocks. The question is always going to be fuel supply and distribution. So I'll pause there. I went too long, but I wanted to address all of those to the extent that I could. So I would turn it to my more technical colleagues.
Steve, before we turn to the other panelists, I just want to pick up on something you said early on in your comments about the flow of electricity between Europe and Ukraine. Wasn't Ukraine plugged into through synchronization, I think it's called, into the European model through Moldova about 2-3 years ago? In what state is that at, or is that doable? Because I know now they're trying, as you mentioned, try to bring electricity back into Ukraine. How doable is that? Because they were supposed to plug Ukraine all the way from Moldova to Portugal, basically, whole grid.
They are plugged in. And I smile when you ask that question because when I was at USAID, my program, they were deeply involved in it. So and it's credit to the Ukrainians and the Europeans. I was glad to be involved in some aspects of it. But I think it's a story that Ukraine was going into an island mode test as part of a longer attempt to integrate into the European system, and that's the night that the Russians attacked. Credit to the Europeans for bringing Ukraine and Moldova fully into their system. And so now from Ukraine to Portugal, it's connected. I think I have not followed the thread recently. It's either 2.1 or 2.4 gigawatts maximum of like instantaneous transfer, which has been critical for keeping Ukraine's grid stable. There are ways to increase that in certain locations, but again, that all the countries need to be involved because of a power system is a very complex. It's like the human body, right? It's a very complex organism. So I'll pause there.
No, that's fine. Okay, thank you. I'll just turn to the other panelists. So Alexei and Paul, if you want to make any comments on Michael's question.
Yeah, if we're talking about interconnectors, indeed, this is an important question. And indeed, we are having the capacity right now up to 2.5 gigawatt. And I know that our government, they started negotiating a possible increase of this capacity because we need more electricity and because we had more generation destroyed. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we have a huge problem if we have this electricity on our western border. We have huge problems how to transmit this electricity to the eastern regions of Ukraine. And in order to resolve this problem, we need Ukrenergo to recover their 750 and 330 substations as soon as possible. So this is a huge problem inside the country. And of course, we have been looking to different new technologies like SMRs as well. And I hope as soon as this technology is well presented, we will be probably one of the first companies in Ukraine who will install such technologies, such systems on our. Maybe last but not the least, what should be mentioning is that the grid system is in a terrible condition right now. And it was built under Soviet Union times, many years ago, and it is not fully compatible to EU standards. And we definitely need to rebuild back better. We need to rebuild back according to EU standards to be more compatible to their standards. And new grid would allow new connections. New connections is a huge problem all around the world, in Europe, Western Europe particularly. And in Ukraine, we are having the same problems. We know that some legal entities, some enterprises would like to connect additional generation capacities, but they cannot do so because of the grid problems or grid inability to connect them. So definitely we need to stress our attention how to rebuild grid system of Ukraine as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you, Alexei. Paul, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of comments. First of all, I want to comment on west to east, kind of Alexei, what he just said about the it's not for me, I look at it as not the difficulty of moving power. Simply, we have a 2,000-kilometer front line, and there's no grid really in that front line. It's been heavily destroyed or damaged. And when I look at the grid or the electricity problem, it's really good to simplify it. Power generation, transmission, and distribution. They're two different things. In many countries, they're owned separately, okay, and managed separately. And so I'm really glad Alexei talked a little bit more right now about transmission and distribution, because at the end of the day, the two have to work together. But when you go west to east, you see the problem magnifies. And that brings me to my next subject. So the reason why we work mostly in frontline areas, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Zaporizhia front, Donbass front, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, is because they need stealthy sources of power. And it's kind of going to sound like a weird term, but when we work with the military, we're now like designing covers for our equipment. So because it used to cost $4 million to have a drone, be able to have heat seeking and infrared. Then it went down to $500,000 with Bayraktar. Now it's under $3,000. You have heat seeking infrared capabilities. So whatever you're putting out there is so easy to see today. Any of our alternative solutions that I discussed. And, if you look at some of these larger questions and you talk about an SMR or whatever, how are you going to hide it? Okay, you got to bring some of these things into question. How are you going to harden it? And by the way, small nuclear is not really small. It's actually kind of big. And let's not forget our legacy with nuclear, access. Everybody here is talking about it from the data center perspective, but is it really something Ukraine will want to do, given our legacy? And who knows what happens with the three major sites today? On the other hand, does it become a protected bubble because it's untouchable? And if it's me, I'd put all those SMRs up against the border with Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania and make European Union a stakeholder if something happens to them. But in any case, I do want to make two other comments. One is, if anybody here's engaged with environmental groups, I believe that there has been an underwhelming reaction from the global environmental community to the destruction, for example, of the Novokakhovka Dam and others, and just in general what's going on. And it's a way to amplify our message. But I think there's some issues why it's not been amplified enough by them or embraced. And the final point I want to make is something Alexei and Ambassador Pyatt commented on. You have to be preparing now for next year. We talked about supply chains and everything. DTEC has the longest, I think, of supply chains, other than some domestic. The kind of things I do are potentially quicker. But if you're an NGO, raise now. So NGOs raise best during crisis and when there's rage. I call them rage donations. So you raise now, but then be deliberate in how you deploy your limited capital and funds. But every year I'm talking to people in August and they're just not thinking about the winter. And if there's any one thing I'd like to come from this is, yes, we have an immediate crisis, but I did mention one thing. A lot of the alternatives, they're not available. They're scarce. Try buying power station in Ukraine right now. Try getting generators, okay, from Western Europe. I purchased a generator on the behalf of one NGO recently. And when I started the week, I got quoted there were 11 pieces for that 100 kVA generator. By Friday, when I bought it, there was one. Okay, so there are scarce resources amongst the alternatives. There are long supply chains, and don't get discouraged if you can't get what you can today. It's okay to wait because it's going to be needed longer. So I'm just hopefully, Roman, that gives you a little extra perspective.
No, that's very helpful. Michael, we're at the hour and a half mark. I don't know how much
I think,
you want to continue this.
yeah, I think that's fine. This has been truly a wealth of information from all of our panelists. I'd like to thank, on behalf of the organization of the Ukrainian Congress Committee, thank you to all of our panelists taking so much time out of your day on this very critical topic. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador Popadiuk, for moderating. It was an excellent discussion. And again, as I said, is that the UCCA, we are here in terms of representing the community, representing the concerns of the community in front of Congress, in front of the administration, on a local level with governors, with city administrations as well, for the sole purpose of enhancing the bilateral relationship between Ukraine and the United States. And right now, there is no more critical issue, obviously, than the energy crisis which is existing right now in Ukraine. We formed an emergency energy task force in middle of December exactly for this particular purpose. And we see its fruition right now with today's webinar. But obviously, we still continue to look for donations, humanitarian aspects associated with the Ukrainians, the plight of Ukrainians as they're suffering right now within a very harsh and brutal winter. Lastly, if I can say that what I had mentioned in terms of my question to Ambassador Pyatt, we do have an advocacy event February 23rd and 24th in Washington, D.C. All of you as participants today in today's webinar will receive information about that. Please join us if you can. Help us to advocate on behalf of these critical needs for Ukraine. And lastly, please follow us on social media, all of our platforms, Facebook, Twitter, X as it's called now, Instagram, and most recently Substack. So thank you very much. I'm sure that there will be a follow-up, especially in terms of how we are progressing, how this $250 million of U.S. assistance is progressing or not progressing, and what more we need to do. So I'm sure that there will be many follow-ups in the future. To our friends in Ukraine, please stay safe. You know that we are with you 100%, and to all of our friends here in the United States as well, and to the participants, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay warm, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Okay.